If I may, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg began, her voice soft but commanding. She opened a slim folder before her, the pages neatly annotated in her familiar handwriting. Let me start with a little history. When I began challenging gender discrimination in the early 1970s, the law did not see women as equals. It saw them as exceptions. The room had fallen utterly still. Her tone was quiet, but it filled every corner of the hall. A woman could be fired simply for becoming pregnant. A bank could deny her a credit card unless a husband co-signed. Universities could openly refuse women admission. And in most states, a husband could not legally be charged for raping his wife. She lifted her gaze toward Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, steady and unflinching. You call my approach too slow, too careful. But I chose the deliberate path because I understood how our Constitution works. Precedent builds like bricks. You lay one, then another, until the wall of injustice begins to crack. Her voice strengthened. You call them timid steps. Let me remind you whose lives those steps changed. Sally Reed, a mother denied the right to manage her dead son's estate because she was a woman. Sharon Frontiero, an Air Force lieutenant, told her service was worth less than a man's. Stephen Wiesenfeld, a widower, denied benefits meant to help raise his baby after his wife died in childbirth. These weren't theories. They were people, families, facing laws written to erase them. Ginsburg turned another page, her hands steady. When I argued Frontiero versus Richardson, I stood before 9 men in black robes. I could have condemned them as part of a patriarchal system. Instead, I showed them how discrimination against women also diminished their own daughters. I made them see themselves in the injustice. For the first time, her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from memory. That wasn't timidity, she said. That was strategy. You cannot tear down a fortress by shouting at its gates. You dismantle it brick by brick until daylight gets through. In the audience, several students nodded. A few who had earlier cheered for Crockett now sat in reflective silence. You also mentioned my friendship with Justice Scalia, she continued. You see betrayal. I saw opportunity. She lifted a document from the folder, its pages yellowed, edges soft from time. This is an early draft of his opinion in United States versus Virginia, the case that opened the doors of the Virginia Military Institute to women. His original language would have narrowed the decision's reach. But after weeks of discussion, civil, yes, but persistent, that language disappeared. He didn't change his vote, but the scope of the ruling expanded. Thousands of women benefited. She looked up. That was not surrender, Congresswoman. That was influence, the kind that endures longer than outrage. Crockett shifted at the podium, her earlier defiance tempered now into something quieter. As for my dissents, Ginsburg said, her tone even but edged with fire, you dismiss them as powerless. You misunderstand their purpose. A dissent challenges the majority to strengthen its reasoning. It gives future advocates the tools to fight back. And it speaks, not to today, but to tomorrow. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Crockett, her blue eyes sharp and bright. When I wrote that discarding the Voting Rights Act's pre-clearance rule was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, she said, I wasn't writing for tote bags or slogans. I was writing for the moment the storm returned. The silence that followed was total. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. For a fleeting second, the Congresswoman appeared at a loss for words. Around them, the audience, students, jurists, and ordinary citizens, watched history unfold in real time. Not a clash of ego, but a passing of the torch, lit by conviction on both sides. I was laying down a legal principle. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg continued, her voice steady but unmistakably firm, that civil rights advocates still use in courts across America today to challenge restrictive voting laws. From somewhere in the audience, a professor leaned toward her colleague and whispered, she's right. That dissent is cited in every single voting rights brief. A quiet wave of agreement rippled through the rows of scholars. You also mentioned my decision not to retire during President Obama's administration. Ginsburg went on, her tone calm and unflinching. That choice was not made out of arrogance or denial. It was based on my health, my energy, and my belief that I could still serve. None of us can see the future with perfect clarity. We act with the information we have, and I truly believed I still had more to give. She tapped her papers into a neat pile, the gesture small but deliberate, before leaning forward slightly. The soft light caught the edge of her dissent collar, and her voice deepened with conviction. But let us not turn this conversation into a false choice between two extremes, quiet civility or angry defiance. Progress in a democracy has never come from just one approach. It has always taken many working in concert. She gestured lightly with one hand, as though balancing scales in the air. While I built precedent, others marched. While I persuaded conservative judges with reasoning they could not easily reject, activists filled the streets, demanding the change we were constructing case by case. Those paths didn't compete, they completed one another. In the front row, a young law student scribbled furiously in her notebook, her face lit with the recognition that she was hearing something historic, an unfiltered glimpse into the justice's philosophy. "You call my incrementalism timidity," Ginsburg said, her tone sharpening again. But it was intentional, crafted from an understanding of how the law actually operates. The rulings we won in the 1970s established that gender discrimination violates the Constitution. Those cases are the foundation your generation now stands upon. Without them, your arguments in court today would have no ground to hold. She closed the folder gently and rested her palms on it, her gaze sweeping the audience. Dr. King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." What people forget is that it doesn't bend by itself. It takes hands, many hands, pulling it forward. Some of us do that work inside the system, reshaping it piece by piece. Others push from outside, demanding the impossible. Both are necessary to move the world. Her tone shifted, less courtroom, more classroom now, as though she were guiding a student through a lesson. "You judge my career by the persistence of struggle," she said. "But progress doesn't erase hardship. It gives the next generation a stronger place to stand." Social change is not a straight line. It rises, it dips, it returns stronger. Every movement faces backlash. That doesn't mean the work failed. It means it mattered enough to threaten the powerful. She gestured toward the portraits lining the auditorium's walls. Thurgood Marshall didn't fail because racism endures. Susan B. Anthony didn't fail because sexism persists. Their work, like mine, like yours, was never about finishing the story. It was about ensuring it could continue. Her expression softened slightly, though her eyes still held their steel. "And as for my likeness on mugs and tote bags," she said, her mouth curving faintly, "those images have inspired thousands of young women to imagine themselves as judges, lawyers, leaders. Symbols matter. They awaken something in people long before laws can." She drew herself upright once more, shoulders squared, presence filling the stage with quiet force. "And if you believe my legacy ends with dissents," she said, her voice gaining weight, "I invite you to study my opinions more closely, especially United States versus Virginia. That ruling didn't just open the doors of the Virginia Military Institute to women. It made clear, once and for all, that the government cannot justify exclusion on the basis of gender. That wasn't rhetoric. That was law." The audience sat in spellbound silence. Even Crockett, who had come prepared to battle, found herself momentarily still, watching as the frail-looking woman before her transformed decades of criticism into a masterclass in conviction, intellect, and grace. "I wrote for the majority," Justice Ginsburg said, her tone level and assured, "that any law distinguishing between men and women must rest on an exceedingly persuasive justification. That standard, nearly the highest this court has ever applied in gender cases, continues to protect women's rights today." She folded her hands, her voice settling into an even steadier rhythm. "Congresswoman, I have spent my entire professional life fighting for equality. I have done it with strategy, patience, and an understanding of how institutions bend, slowly but surely, toward progress. You may choose a more confrontational path, and that is absolutely your right. But hear me clearly. Social movements need many kinds of warriors." Her gaze held firm. "Do not mistake carefulness for fear. Do not confuse civility with surrender. Some of us choose our battles with precision not because we lack courage, but because we understand how lasting change is made. It requires both moral urgency and legal discipline. It needs voices that can inspire a crowd and voices that can persuade a courtroom. Real reform demands vision, but it also demands craft." The edges of her tone softened, though the conviction behind it only deepened. "I respect your passion," she continued, and I share your impatience. Justice moves far too slowly for anyone who knows injustice firsthand. But wisdom, true wisdom, lies in knowing when to confront and when to persuade, when to shout and when to reason, when to demand with fire and when to speak in a way that your opponent cannot ignore. Her words landed with the clarity of a gavel strike. The silence that followed was absolute. Congresswoman Crockett stood frozen at the podium, her expression caught between admiration and reckoning. Ginsburg's response had not been a rebuke, it was a lesson, a precise, layered masterclass in advocacy from one of the sharpest legal minds of her generation. The audience seemed suspended between awe and reflection. The moderator, after a long pause, finally found his voice. "Thank you, Justice Ginsburg," he said carefully. Then, turning to the Congresswoman, "Would you care to respond?" Crockett glanced down at her notes, then up again at the justice. Her earlier fire had been replaced by something quieter, respect, maybe even humility. "I appreciate Justice Ginsburg's perspective," she said at last. "I think we all have much to consider." As she stepped away from the microphone, the air in the auditorium shifted. The tension that had once filled the room dissolved into recognition. Everyone understood they had witnessed something far greater than an academic debate. It was not just one woman defending her record. It was a meditation on how justice itself evolves, through visionaries who push and architects who build. Within hours, clips of the exchange exploded online. Hashtags like #strategic advocacy and #RBG Masterclass dominated national trends. Commentators replayed her words on loop, dissecting each line as though it were scripture. The Washington Post called it a generational reckoning on the future of activism. The New York Times described it as a profound reflection on the mechanics of change in a democracy. On CNN, legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin noted, "What we witnessed wasn't self-defense, it was a defense of principle." Justice Ginsburg reminded the nation that progress built on precedent is the kind that endures. MSNBC hosted a panel of women's rights lawyers from across eras. One of them, a former ACLU attorney who had once worked alongside Ginsburg, summed it up with quiet pride. She never compromised on equality. She just understood that winning it required patience, precision, and persistence. That was always her genius. By nightfall, the moment had already entered the collective memory, a rare instance where intellect silenced politics and wisdom reclaimed the spotlight. Justice Ginsburg hadn't simply spoken. She had reminded America that true change is not a sprint of outrage but a long, disciplined climb. One step, one case, one generation at a time. Across law schools nationwide, the exchange between Justice Ginsburg and Congresswoman Crockett became an instant teaching moment. Professors began dissecting it in classrooms as a model of advocacy, persuasion, and generational tension within social movements. At Harvard Law, students packed into an auditorium for a spontaneous forum on the strategy of reform. At Howard University, a civil rights professor played the viral clip, inviting students to analyze the contrasting ways that institutional change can unfold, from courtroom arguments to grassroots confrontation. But outside the lecture halls, the aftermath was more complicated. Crockett's social media feeds exploded, thousands of comments poured in. Some accused her of disrespecting an icon. Others praised her for voicing frustrations that younger generations of activists often feel. After a brief silence, she released a short statement. She respected Justice Ginsburg's historic contributions, but still believed that new times call for new tools. 3 days later, she expanded on that thought in a reflective essay for The Atlantic. "My exchange with Justice Ginsburg," she wrote, "has made me think more deeply about how different forms of advocacy depend on one another. I still believe we need fearless voices who demand justice without compromise. But I now understand more clearly how those demands rest on the legal and institutional groundwork others have built. One cannot succeed without the other." The essay struck a chord. The most powerful responses didn't come from pundits or politicians, but from young lawyers, organizers, and public defenders. Many admitted they had long felt torn, admiring Ginsburg's meticulous legal strategy while resonating with Crockett's sense of urgency. Blogs and forums lit up with spirited debates about whether real progress came from careful institution building or from relentless disruption. "Maybe the truth is," one young attorney posted, "we need both. The Ginsburgs laying the bricks of precedent and the Crockett's shaking the walls to remind us what still needs changing. They don't cancel each other out. They complete the fight. A week after the symposium, Ginsburg joined NPR's Nina Totenberg for a thoughtful conversation. When asked about the confrontation, she answered without hesitation. The Congresswoman raised important questions, she said. Every generation has to find its own voice in the struggle for equality. My generation built the scaffolding, but the next must decide what to raise upon it. Totenberg pressed gently. Did the criticism sting? Ginsburg smiled faintly. In my early career, I was told I didn't belong in law school because I was taking a man's seat. I was denied clerkships, underpaid, and underestimated. Compared to that, a respectful critique of my judicial philosophy hardly feels like an injury. It's part of progress itself. The ripple effects were tangible. Enrollment in civil rights and advocacy courses spiked across universities. At Georgetown Law, administrators launched an annual event titled Many Roads to Justice, featuring activists, litigators, and community organizers who shared their approaches to social change. 6 months later, Ginsburg announced her retirement, citing health reasons. In her farewell statement, she mentioned the now-famous exchange by name. The conversation about how best to pursue equality must never end, she wrote. Each generation builds upon the last, sometimes continuing the same path, sometimes clearing a new one. Both are essential. Her final public appearance came weeks later, a modest event at a D.C. auditorium filled with students, advocates, and colleagues. When asked what message she wanted to leave for young activists frustrated by slow progress, she paused, looked out across the room, and spoke with quiet conviction. Fight for the things you care about, she said, but fight in ways that bring others along with you. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't just applause for a career, it was for a philosophy, a reminder that progress doesn't belong to one generation or one method. It belongs to the collective courage to keep moving forward, step by step, case by case, until justice bends a little closer toward equality. Understand that true progress rarely happens overnight. Real change demands patience, foresight, and the courage to reshape institutions rather than simply destroy them. 3 years later, Congresswoman Crockett embodied that lesson when she introduced a landmark bill aimed at strengthening voting rights protections. During the floor debate, she invoked Justice Ginsburg's legendary dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, recalling the justice's vivid warning about throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a storm because you're not getting wet. When the bill ultimately passed with bipartisan support, Crockett credited the victory not to her own passion alone, but to the generations of advocates whose legal groundwork had made such progress possible. This, she said in her closing remarks, stands on the shoulders of Justice Ginsburg and every civil rights lawyer who believed that steady work could bend history. The Georgetown law confrontation between Ginsburg and Crockett became much more than a viral clip. It evolved into a cornerstone lesson on how movements truly grow. Law schools, advocacy groups, and think tanks across the country began citing it as a study in how strategic patience and bold urgency can coexist. What began as a tense exchange had transformed into a defining dialogue on the nature of progress itself. As one constitutional scholar later wrote in the Yale Law Journal, the Ginsburg-Crockett moment was never about winning an argument. It was about illuminating the truth that reform needs both kinds of visionaries, the architects who build the system stronger and the agitators who remind us that time is running out. That insight resonated far beyond the legal world. Community organizers, educators, and civic leaders began referencing the exchange in speeches and workshops, framing it as a living example of democratic dialogue at its best, passionate, respectful, and rooted in shared purpose. Even political commentators who rarely agreed found common ground in its message, that justice advances when conviction meets collaboration. In classrooms, young students debated which approach spoke to them more deeply, the deliberate, precedent-building strategy of Ginsburg or the unflinching urgency of Crockett. Most concluded that neither could stand alone. Movements don't survive on one rhythm, a Harvard student said during a televised panel. They need both the steady heartbeat of structure and the pulse of rebellion. By the time Crockett's bill became law, it symbolized something larger than a single piece of legislation. It stood as proof that fierce idealism and measured pragmatism, when united, can create lasting change. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth reflection on the transformative dialogue between Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a moment that redefined what it means to fight for equality in America. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that explore the intersection of law, leadership, and humanity. And tell us in the comments, do you believe progress is best achieved through persistence, through pressure, or through the balance of both? Your voice keeps this conversation and the fight for justice alive.